The frozen patience. The cold wind cuts through everything in this strange tale from the Old West. Snow falls heavy on the mountains as we tell you about Dr. Edmund Langford and his frozen patience. This story comes from old papers, letters, and reports found in a mining town called Whitethornne. Whitethornne was never meant to last forever. Like many towns that popped up during the gold rush, it started when people found silver in 1868. The town sat in a narrow valley between tall pine trees and dangerous mountains. Soon, almost 500 people lived there: miners, shop owners, gamblers, and those who took advantage of others. By winter 1871, Whitethornne had become a real town. Main Street had wooden buildings with fake fronts, a general store, a bar called the Temperance, 2 places where people could rent rooms, and at the north end, where the road went into the forest, stood Dr. Edmund Langford's medical office and home. The main person who saw these events was Jonathan Mercer. He was a newspaper writer from Boston who came west to write stories about frontier life for people back east. His detailed diary gives us most of what we know about the weird things that happened in Whitethornne. December 12, 1871. I got to Whitethornne yesterday after a hard trip from Helena. The stagecoach driver, a quiet man named Holcomb, seemed in a hurry to drop me off and leave before dark. When I asked about places to stay, he told me exactly where to go: Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house. He acted like the other place, Fuller's I think, was not good. Mrs. Abernathy turned out to be a tough but kind widow. After she made sure I wasn't a drunk or a thief, she gave me a small but clean room upstairs. During dinner of deer stew and good bread, I asked about the different people in Whitethornne. I hoped to find subjects for my newspaper articles. That's when I first heard about Dr. Edmund Langford. Mrs. Abernathy talked about him with a mix of respect and worry. A good doctor, she said. Trained back east in Philadelphia. Not like those fake doctors and medicine sellers you find in most camps. But then she stopped talking and started cleaning dishes. When I asked more questions, she would only say, "He keeps to himself mostly. Takes care of the miners when they get hurt, which happens a lot in this place. But I wouldn't call on him unless I really had to." December 13, 1871. I met Sheriff Thomas Blackwood today. He's a big man who stands like a military officer and talks with a southern accent that suggests he fought for the South in the war, though I didn't think it was smart to ask directly. He was friendly enough when I explained why I was in Whitethornne, though he seemed to doubt that Eastern readers would find much interesting about their simple town. "We are just simple people trying to dig silver from rock and survive the winters," he said. "Nothing special here except maybe the cold." When I mentioned Dr. Langford, something changed in the sheriff's behavior. He stood up straighter and looked at me with new suspicion. "Doctor's a private man," he said carefully. "Does good work. Saved many a miner who would have died from accidents or fever. I'd suggest you respect his privacy if you plan to write about our town." The warning, though said casually, clearly meant business. I told the sheriff I meant no harm and only wanted to write about frontier professionals for my readers. This seemed to satisfy him, and we talked about other things, though I noticed he kept our conversation short after that. I spent the next few days getting to know Whitethornne. I interviewed miners, the store owner, and even the saloon keeper, a surprisingly well-educated former school teacher named Jameson who came west after the war to forget, as he mysteriously put it. But Dr. Langford remained hard to find. December 16, 1871. 3 days in Whitethornne, and I still haven't seen the doctor who has become the most interesting person in my investigation. His house and office sit away from the main town. It's a 2-story wooden building painted dull gray. Smoke always rises from 2 chimneys, showing the building stays warm despite the bitter cold. This struck me as odd since firewood is scarce and expensive in this remote place. Today, I finally met someone willing to talk more openly about Langford, a young woman named Clara Sullivan who helps the doctor as a nurse. I met her at the general store where she was buying supplies. After I introduced myself and expressed interest in frontier medicine, she spoke with clear admiration for Dr. Langford's medical skills. "He's a real doctor, sir. Not one of those fake healers selling colored water as miracle cures," she told me. "He studied the latest methods in Philadelphia and worked as a surgeon during the war. The miners trust him because he doesn't make promises he can't keep. and he's not afraid of the difficult cases that would make other doctors run away. When I asked what brought such a qualified doctor to a remote place like Whitethornne, her expression became guarded. "Dr. Langford came here to do his research," she said after hesitating. "The isolation helps his work." "What kind of research does the doctor do?" I asked. Sheriff Blackwood appeared at the store before she could answer. He greeted Miss Sullivan politely before giving me a short nod. My conversation with the young nurse ended there, though she did agree, somewhat reluctantly, that I might visit the doctor's office tomorrow to ask for an interview. December 17th, 1871. I have met Dr. Edmund Langford, and I must say he is not what I expected. From the townspeople's mysterious comments and obvious worry, I had imagined a scary figure, maybe hunched and old with piercing eyes and a manner that inspired fear. The reality was quite different. Dr. Langford appears to be in his early 40s, tall and straight-backed, with the build of a man used to both thinking and physical work. His hair is dark with distinguished silver at the sides, and he wears a neatly trimmed beard. There is nothing immediately unusual about how he looks, except perhaps his eyes, a pale blue so light they appear almost colorless in certain light, giving him a penetrating stare that could indeed be unsettling. I arrived at his office at 9 a.m. to find Miss Sullivan treating an elderly miner with frostbitten fingers. She acknowledged me with a slight nod but continued her work, applying some ointment to the blackened digits with remarkable gentleness. The waiting room was simple but perfectly clean, unusual for the frontier, with several wooden chairs, a pot-bellied stove giving off welcome heat, and shelves lined with medical books. What struck me immediately was the temperature. Despite the stove's efforts, the air held a distinct chill, noticeably colder than Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house or the general store. Before I could think about this oddity, a door opened and Dr. Langford himself appeared. "Mr. Mercer, I presume," he said, extending his hand. His grip was firm but extremely cold, which he seemed to notice from my expression. "Forgive me," he added with a slight smile. "I've just come from my back room. The cold serves my work." He invited me into his office, a well-furnished room with a desk, examination table, and glass-fronted cabinets containing instruments and medicines. Unlike the waiting room, this chamber was pleasantly warm. The doctor sat behind his desk and looked at me with polite interest. "Miss Sullivan mentioned your writing about frontier medicine," he said. "A worthy pursuit. Few back east understand the challenges we face here." I explained my assignment in more detail, and he listened carefully, occasionally asking thoughtful questions about my previous articles and Eastern views of territorial life. His manner was friendly and professional, showing none of the secretiveness I had been led to expect. When I finally brought up the subject of his research, however, a subtle change came over him. Nothing as dramatic as alarm or anger, just heightened attention, as though measuring me for some purpose I couldn't understand. "My research," he repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, that is what brought me to this remote place. Tell me, Mr. Mercer, are you familiar with the work of Dr. John Hunter regarding the effects of temperature on living tissue?" I admitted my ignorance, and he nodded as though this was expected. Few are outside specialized medical circles. Hunter showed that tissue death could be delayed through application of cold, a significant finding, though his experiments were necessarily limited by the technology of his time. He paused, studying me. "What would you say, Mr. Mercer, if I told you I have expanded on Hunter's work in ways that could fundamentally change our understanding of life and death?" There was something in his manner, an intensity coupled with absolute conviction, that unsettled me despite his perfectly reasonable tone. Before I could respond, a commotion erupted from the waiting room, raised voices and the heavy sound of multiple boots. The doctor rose immediately. "Excuse me," he said. "It seems duty calls." I followed him out to find 3 miners supporting a 4th whose leg was bent at an unnatural angle, the pants torn and soaked with blood. Without hesitation, Langford took command of the situation, directing the men to place their injured companion on the examination table in the next room. "Mining accident?" he asked crisply as he cut away the ruined pants. "Tunnel collapse," one of the miners confirmed. "Timber support gave way." would have crushed him entirely if Ali hadn't pulled him back, but his leg was caught. What followed was a demonstration of medical skill that would have impressed the most experienced doctors of Boston or New York. Dr. Langford worked with calm efficiency, giving chloroform, cleaning the wound, a compound fracture with bones sticking through the flesh, and setting it with experienced hands. Miss Sullivan assisted silently, anticipating his needs with remarkable precision, handing instruments before he asked for them. Throughout the procedure, I watched from the doorway, forgotten in the emergency. The doctor's manner never wavered. No disgust at the gruesome injury, no hesitation in his movements, no concern for the blood that stained his previously spotless shirt. Here was a man entirely in his element. When the leg was set, splinted and bandaged, and the patient unconscious but stable, Langford finally seemed to remember my presence. "My apologies for the interruption, Mr. Mercer," he said, washing blood from his hands in a basin. "Such is the nature of medical practice in mining communities. Perhaps we might continue our conversation another day. I must monitor this patient for the next several hours." I readily agreed, suggesting I might return tomorrow afternoon. As I turned to leave, something beyond the partially open door at the rear of the surgery caught my attention. A glimpse of what appeared to be a much larger room, dimly lit and noticeably colder, judging by the visible breath of Miss Sullivan as she entered it. Just before the door closed, I saw what seemed to be large cabinet-like structures arranged along the walls. "Until tomorrow then, Mr. Mercer," Dr. Langford said, his tone pleasant but dismissive. I nodded and left, though my curiosity was now thoroughly inflamed by that tantalizing glimpse of the mysterious back room. I returned to my lodgings with more questions than answers. That evening, seeking additional perspectives on the mysterious doctor, I engaged Mrs. Abernathy in conversation, gently pressing for details about Langford's history in Whitethornne. December 17, 1871 evening. Mrs. Abernathy proved surprisingly talkative after her initial reluctance. Perhaps loosened by the medicinal brandy she permits herself each evening for her rheumatism. "Dr. Langford came to Whitethornne in the spring of '69, she told me, settling into her chair by the stove. "Caused quite a stir, him arriving with all those crates and that fancy equipment. Took over old man Prescott's place at the edge of town, had it expanded considerably, adding that big room at the back and putting in all manner of peculiar requirements. Insisted on having the thickest walls possible with extra insulation of some kind. Hired every available man for the work and paid handsomely." "Was there a particular reason he chose Whitethornne?" I asked. Mrs. Abernathy's expression grew thoughtful. "The cold, I expect. He asked a great many questions about our winters before deciding to settle. How low the temperature drops, how long the cold spells last. Seemed pleased when told we're often cut off for months when the mountain passes snow over." She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice, though we were alone in her parlor. "There's something else that always struck me as peculiar. Since he arrived, there's been an unusual arrangement with the ice cutters. Throughout winter, they deliver large quantities to his practice, more than any reasonable person could use. And in summer, he has ice brought down from the high mountain lakes at considerable expense. Perhaps for medical purposes," I suggested, "to treat fevers or preserve medicines." "Perhaps," she conceded, though her tone suggested skepticism. "But there's been talk. When the first deep cold came after his arrival, there was a consumption case, a young woman, daughter of the blacksmith, terminal by all accounts. Dr. Langford took her in, ostensibly for comfort care. Her family was allowed to visit initially, then gradually discouraged. When she finally passed, the doctor handled all arrangements, even the burial. But some say..." She hesitated. "Yes," I prompted. "Some say she didn't die, at least not as we understand it. Jameson at the saloon swears he saw her through a window in Langford's back room weeks after her supposed funeral. Just a glimpse, he said, but he was certain. Of course, he'd been drinking, so few gave his claim much credence." Over the next few days, I continued my investigation into Dr. Langford's activities. I interviewed miners who had been treated by the doctor, the blacksmith whose daughter had allegedly died under Langford's care, The man was reluctant to speak, but revealed that he had never viewed his daughter's body after her passing. And Jameson, the saloon-keeper, who confirmed his strange sighting but admitted he could not be entirely certain given the circumstances. My curiosity increasingly focused on the mysterious back room and its contents. My opportunity to learn more came unexpectedly. December 20th, 1871. A development I could not have anticipated. This evening, as I was returning to my lodgings after supper at the town's small cafe, I encountered Miss Sullivan hurrying through the twilight, her expression troubled. Upon seeing me, she paused, seemingly torn by some internal conflict. "Mr. Mercer," she said after a moment's hesitation, "might I have a word?" We stepped into the shadow between buildings, away from the few passers-by on the main street. In the fading light, her face appeared drawn, her usual composure fractured by whatever burden she carried. "You've been asking questions about Dr. Langford's work," she said without preamble. "About the patients who have died under his care." I acknowledged this, adding that my interest was professional and not meant to cast doubt on the doctor's methods. "His methods," she repeated softly. "Yes, that's precisely what concerns me. I've assisted Dr. Langford for nearly 2 years, Mr. Mercer. I've respected his brilliance, his dedication, but recently—" She glanced over her shoulder, though there was no one near. "Recently, I've begun to question the ethics of his research." My pulse quickened at this confirmation that there was indeed something unorthodox about Langford's work. "Perhaps you could be more specific, Miss Sullivan." She drew a deep breath. "Dr. Langford believes death is not an absolute state, but rather a continuum that can be arrested under specific conditions. His theory is that extreme cold can preserve not just the body, but some essence of the person, suspended between life and death, potentially for years, until medical science advances sufficiently to revive and cure them." I confess I was momentarily speechless. The concept she described sounded more like the fanciful tales of Mary Shelley than serious medical research. Yet Miss Sullivan's evident distress suggested she was in earnest. "And he has patients in this suspended state?" I finally asked. She nodded grimly. "In the back room, special containers he designed. He calls them preservation chambers. They're maintained at temperatures well below freezing using ice and a salt solution. Currently, there are 7 individuals in these chambers, all officially pronounced dead." "Good God!" I murmured. "And these people consented to this procedure?" "Some did," she said, her voice barely audible. "Terminal cases who grasped at any hope, however theoretical. They signed documents Dr. Langford prepared, granting permission for what he terms cryogenic preservation. But others—" She faltered. "I fear not all were fully informed or capable of consent. The blacksmith's daughter, for instance, was delirious with fever when Langford had her sign the papers." "Miss Sullivan, these are serious allegations," I said, my mind reeling at the implications. "If what you're saying is true, I can show you," she interrupted. "Tonight, Dr. Langford has gone to attend a difficult birth at a homestead several miles out. He won't return until morning. I can take you into the back room. You can see for yourself." I should have hesitated, should have considered the propriety and potential consequences of such an action. Instead, I heard myself agreeing immediately, my journalistic instincts overwhelming any reservation. We arranged to meet at midnight behind the doctor's practice. As we parted, Miss Sullivan gripped my arm, her fingers digging through my coat sleeve. "Tell no one of this, Mr. Mercer. And understand, I'm not certain what we're witnessing is wrong. Dr. Langford truly believes he's preserving lives, not desecrating death. But I need someone else to see, to help me determine if we've crossed a boundary that shouldn't be breached." December 21st, 1871, early hours. I scarcely know how to record what I have witnessed tonight. My hand trembles even now, partly from the lingering cold that seemed to penetrate to my very bones during our secret exploration, and partly from the profound disturbance of what can only be described as a chamber of frozen souls. I met Miss Sullivan as arranged. The night was clear and bitterly cold, the stars painfully bright in the black sky. She appeared from the shadows wrapped in a heavy cloak, her breath clouding before her. Without speaking, she led me to a rear entrance of the doctor's practice, unlocking it with a key she produced from her pocket. "Dr. Langford entrusted me with this for emergencies," she whispered as we entered. "He'll never know it was used tonight." We passed through a storage area, then the surgery I had glimpsed during my previous visit. Miss Sullivan lit a small lantern, keeping the flame low, and unlocked another door, this one unusually thick and fitted with some sort of rubber seal around its edges. "Prepare yourself," she warned, "and we must be brief. The cold is intense." She was not exaggerating. As the door swung open, a blast of frigid air struck us with almost physical force. I gasped involuntarily, my lungs protesting the sudden chill. Miss Sullivan handed me a heavy blanket from a nearby shelf, wrapping another around her own shoulders before leading me into what she called the preservation chamber. The room was larger than I had imagined, perhaps 30 feet long and 20 wide, with a high ceiling. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light of our single lantern, I saw what appeared to be large metal cabinets arranged along 3 walls. A complicated system of pipes connected these structures to large tanks and what looked like pumping mechanisms. The constant low hum I had initially attributed to the wind was actually coming from this equipment. "Dr. Langford designed it himself," Miss Sullivan explained, her voice hushed. "The principles are based on commercial ice houses, but refined for precision. The solution circulating through the pipes contains salt and other compounds that lower the freezing point, allowing for temperatures well below what natural ice alone could achieve." I was still absorbing the technical aspects when she approached one of the cabinet-like structures. "These are the preservation chambers themselves," she said, placing her hand on the metal surface. "Each maintains a constant temperature according to Dr. Langford's calculations." With evident reluctance, she reached for a latch on the front of the nearest chamber. "This contains Eliza Cooper, the blacksmith's daughter. She was the first." I want to believe I would have stopped her had I fully comprehended what was about to be revealed. Instead, I stood transfixed as she slowly opened the heavy door. A cloud of crystalline vapor billowed out, momentarily obscuring the interior. As it dissipated, I found myself staring at the figure of a young woman, perhaps 17 or 18 years of age. She lay on what appeared to be a metal slab, dressed in a simple white gown. Her skin was pale with a bluish tinge, her blonde hair frosted with ice crystals. Her eyes were closed, her expression peaceful, as though in deep sleep rather than death. But it was death. It must have been death, despite Dr. Langford's theories and elaborate mechanisms. I was looking at a corpse preserved, certainly, in a state remarkable for its lack of decomposition, but a corpse nonetheless. Wasn't I? And then I saw her chest rise. The slightest movement, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable once observed. And again, perhaps a minute later, not breathing as we understand it, but something so slow, so minimal, it existed in some twilight realm between respiration and its absence. "My God!" I whispered. "She's alive." "Not alive," Miss Sullivan corrected, her tone clinical despite the tremor in her voice. "Not as medicine defines it. But not entirely dead either. Suspended. Her heart beats perhaps once every 15 minutes. A single breath might take 5 minutes to complete. Brain activity is theoretically present, but so diminished as to be undetectable by current methods." She closed the chamber door, securing the latch, then moved to another. "This is Thomas Weaver, a miner with advanced tuberculosis. He came to Dr. Langford specifically requesting preservation after reading some pamphlet on scientific advances. He was fully conscious when he consented." She opened this chamber to reveal a middle-aged man with a gaunt face, similarly preserved. The same nearly imperceptible signs of suspended animation were present. "And here," she continued, moving to a third chamber, "is where ethical considerations become more troubling." The occupant of this chamber was a man I recognized, a miner named Fletcher who had allegedly died in a cave-in the previous month. His preservation was different from the others. Parts of his body showed evidence of severe trauma, now frozen in grotesque stillness. "Fletcher never consented," Miss Sullivan said quietly. He was brought in unconscious after the accident, already dying. Dr. Langford made the decision unilaterally, claiming the man had no family to object and that it was an opportunity to test the procedure on traumatic injuries. We proceeded through the room, Miss Sullivan revealing each of the 7 occupied chambers. Some contained individuals who had apparently given informed consent. Others were more ambiguous cases. All exhibited the same uncanny state, neither alive in any meaningful sense, yet somehow not fully embraced by death. "What is the purpose?" I finally asked as we surveyed the last chamber. "Even if this suspension is real, what benefit can it serve?" Dr. Langford believes medical science will eventually advance to the point where these conditions can be cured and the patients revived, she explained. Tuberculosis, cancer, even traumatic injuries. He envisions a future where these are easily treatable. He sees himself as a bridge between current limitations and future possibilities. And if that future never arrives? She had no answer to this. Instead, she gestured toward an 8th chamber, somewhat separated from the others. "This one is empty, prepared for the next subject. Dr. Langford has been corresponding with a woman in Helena suffering from an inoperable tumor. She's expected to arrive next week." I shuddered, though whether from the cold or the implications, I cannot say. "Miss Sullivan, this goes beyond unorthodox research. If what you've shown me is accurately represented, Dr. Langford is operating in a realm that challenges not just medical ethics, but our very understanding of life and death." "Yes," she said simply. "That's why I needed someone else to witness this. I've assisted him for so long, believing in his vision, that I no longer trust my own moral compass. Is he a visionary or a madman? Are these people being given a second chance at life, or are their natural deaths being perverted for the sake of scientific ambition?" We were both shivering violently by this point, our extended exposure to the extreme cold taking its toll despite the blankets. With obvious reluctance, Miss Sullivan indicated we should leave. As we secured the heavy door behind us, returning to the relative warmth of the surgery, a terrible thought occurred to me. "Miss Sullivan, what happens if the machinery fails? Or if insufficient ice is available? Do these patients simply thaw?" Her expression confirmed my fears before she spoke. "It happened once last summer, during an unusual heat wave. The ice deliveries were delayed by a landslide. A patient named Rebecca Winters, a young woman with advanced cancer, began to thaw before additional ice could be procured. The process, once begun, could not be reversed. She died." "Death is not quite the right term for what occurred," Miss Sullivan said, her voice hollow. She had already been pronounced dead months earlier. What happened was more akin to a delayed decomposition, but accelerated and accompanied by certain physiological responses that should not have been possible. Her muscles contracted. Her eyes opened. There were sounds. She stopped abruptly. Dr. Langford made significant modifications to the cooling system after that incident. It should not happen again. We parted soon after, each lost in troubling thoughts. I returned to my lodgings through the silent, frozen night, my mind reeling with the implications of what I had witnessed. Is Dr. Langford a pioneer pushing the boundaries of medical science? Or has he strayed into territory man was not meant to explore? Are his patients suspended in some twilight hope of future salvation, or trapped in an unnatural state between worlds? I must consider carefully what actions, if any, I should take based on tonight's revelations. December 21st, 1871. I was awakened mid-morning by forceful knocking at my door. Upon opening it, I found Sheriff Blackwood filling the frame, his expression grim. "Mr. Mercer," he said without preamble, "I need you to accompany me to my office. There are some questions requiring your attention." His tone made it clear this was not a request. I dressed hastily and followed him through the snow-covered street. We walked in silence, observed by curious townspeople who quickly averted their gaze when I caught their eyes. The sheriff's office was a small but solid building adjacent to the town's two-cell jail. Inside, seated behind the sheriff's desk with the composure of one accustomed to authority, was Dr. Langford, his pale eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Mr. Mercer," he said, his tone deceptively mild. "I understand you took an unauthorized tour of my facilities last night." I glanced around for Miss Sullivan, who had apparently betrayed our confidence, but she was nowhere to be seen. The sheriff remained by the door, effectively blocking any exit. "Please sit," Langford continued, gesturing to a chair across from him. "We have much to discuss." I sat, attempting to project a confidence I did not feel. "I assume Miss Sullivan informed you of our visit." I should clarify that she acted out of concern for ethical propriety, not malice. A faint smile touched Langford's lips. "Clara didn't inform me of anything, Mr. Mercer. She remains unaware that your nocturnal exploration was observed." This revelation chilled me more than the preservation chamber had. "You were there." "Not physically, no. But my facilities are equipped with certain security measures. Temperature fluctuations are automatically recorded. The preservation chamber door was opened 8 times between midnight and 1 a.m. when I was demonstrably elsewhere. Simple deduction did the rest." He leaned forward, folding his hands on the sheriff's desk. "The question now is what you intend to do with what you've seen." "That depends," I replied, finding my voice at last, "on whether what I've seen constitutes a revolutionary medical breakthrough or an abomination against nature and ethical practice." Langford didn't flinch at my blunt assessment. Instead, he seemed almost pleased by it. "A fair question. Perhaps I can offer some context that Miss Sullivan, for all her competence, cannot fully provide." What followed was the most extraordinary explanation I have ever witnessed. For nearly an hour, Dr. Langford explained his theory of suspended animation through controlled hypothermia, a concept he had been developing since his days as a military surgeon during the war, when he observed that soldiers exposed to extreme cold often survived injuries that would have killed others outright. He spoke of cellular degradation, metabolic processes, and the theoretical possibility of maintaining human tissue in stasis through precise temperature control. His research had progressed from small-scale experiments to human application only after years of careful study and documentation. Every patient in his care, he insisted, had given consent, though I noted he defined consent somewhat more liberally than medical ethics might typically allow. "What you must understand, Mr. Mercer," he said with the fervor of absolute conviction, "is that each person in my care was already lost to conventional medicine. I offered not a cure, but a chance, a bridge to a future where their conditions might be treatable. Is that not preferable to certain death?" "And what of Fletcher?" I challenged. "The miner who never regained consciousness to provide consent?" "A more complex case," Langford admitted. "But consider the alternative. He would have been buried within days, any possibility of future life extinguished permanently. I made a medical judgment that preservation offered his only chance, however remote." "And you appointed yourself the arbiter of that decision," I noted. "Someone must pioneer these advances, Mr. Mercer. Progress in medicine has always required those willing to venture beyond established boundaries." Throughout this exchange, Sheriff Blackwood remained by the door, silent but attentive. I realized then that he was fully aware of Langford's activities, perhaps not in scientific detail, but certainly in general terms. He had made his own judgment and chosen to protect the doctor's work. "What do you want from me, Dr. Langford?" I finally asked. "I assume you didn't arrange this meeting merely to satisfy my curiosity about your methods." "Perceptive," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "I want your discretion, Mr. Mercer. Not permanent silence. I have no illusions about suppressing information indefinitely, but time. My work requires further refinement before exposure to public scrutiny and the inevitable controversy it will generate." "You're asking me to withhold this story from my readers?" "Temporarily," he clarified. 6 months. By then, I will have additional data, more complete documentation. I will be better positioned to defend my methods to the medical establishment." I considered his request. The journalist in me rebelled against suppressing such a significant story. Yet I also recognized the complex ethical dimensions at play. Was Langford a madman desecrating the dead, or a visionary whose work might eventually save countless lives? "And if I decline?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Sheriff Blackwood shifted his weight by the door, the floorboards creaking beneath him. Langford's expression remained impassive. "Then I would be deeply disappointed, Mr. Mercer, as would Sheriff Blackwood, who takes his duty to maintain order in Whitethornne quite seriously. Remote mountain communities can be dangerous places. Accidents occur with unfortunate frequency. The threat, though elegantly veiled, was unmistakable. I found myself at a crossroads with no favorable path forward. To publish what I had seen would likely result in my story being discredited, or worse, prevented from reaching publication entirely. To remain silent would make me complicit in whatever judgment history eventually rendered on Langford's work." Before I could respond, our standoff was interrupted by a commotion outside, shouting voices and running footsteps approaching the sheriff's office. Blackwood opened the door to find a breathless young man, one of the ice cutters who supplied Langford's facility. "Fire!" the young man gasped. "At the doctor's place. The storage shed caught first, but it's spreading to the main building." Langford was on his feet instantly, his face drained of color. "The preservation chambers," he said, more to himself than to us. "If the cooling system fails." He bolted from the office without another word, moving with surprising speed for a man of his age and usual dignity. Sheriff Blackwood followed, pausing only long enough to fix me with a warning glare before he too disappeared toward the growing commotion. Left alone, I had a choice to make. Flee in the confusion, perhaps making my way back to Helena and the safety of civilization, or follow and witness whatever might unfold at Langford's burning facility. Journalistic instinct won out over self-preservation. I headed toward the billowing smoke now visible above the northern edge of town. The scene at Langford's practice was one of barely contained chaos. Flames had indeed begun in the storage shed but had spread rapidly to the rear portion of the main building, the section containing the preservation chamber. Whitethornne had no formal fire brigade, but a bucket line had formed, passing water from the nearby creek in a valiant, if inadequate, effort to combat the blaze. Dr. Langford, heedless of the danger, had rushed into the burning building. Sheriff Blackwood and several miners attempted to restrain him, but he fought with surprising strength, breaking free and disappearing into the smoke. Minutes later, he emerged half-dragging Miss Sullivan, who appeared to have been overcome by smoke while attempting her own rescue of the patients, I presumed not equipment. As Miss Sullivan was tended to by concerned townspeople, Langford turned to re-enter the building. This time, Sheriff Blackwood physically restrained him, perhaps saving his life, for at that moment a portion of the roof collapsed with a terrible cracking sound, sending sparks and burning debris high into the winter air. "The patients!" Langford cried, struggling against the sheriff's grip. "We must evacuate the chambers." "It's too late, Doc," Blackwood said grimly, maintaining his hold. "Building's gone. No one else goes in." Langford's anguish was clear to see, his scientific composure shattered by the destruction of his life's work as the fire consumed the building despite the town's efforts. He sank to his knees in the snow, watching with empty eyes. But the true horror was yet to come. As the fire weakened the structure of the preservation chamber, the cooling systems failed catastrophically. What happened next defies rational explanation, yet I record it faithfully as I witnessed it, along with dozens of Whitethornne's residents. From the burning building came sounds, not the expected creaking of failing timber or hiss of melting ice, but sounds unmistakably human in origin. Moans, first low and barely noticeable, then rising in pitch and intensity. These were not the imagined cries that one might project onto the random noises of a fire, but distinct vocalizations coming from what we all knew were supposedly dead patients. Several miners who had been fighting the fire stumbled back from the building, their faces pale. "There's people alive in there," one shouted. A renewed rescue effort began to form, but Sheriff Blackwood, perhaps the only person besides Langford who fully understood the situation, drew his revolver. "Stay back," he ordered. "No one approaches." Through the smoke and flames, dark figures became visible within the building. Moving, struggling forms silhouetted against the fire. One appeared in a shattered window frame, a vaguely human shape wreathed in flames, its movements jerky and uncoordinated. As the transfixed crowd watched in horror, It tumbled forward, falling to the snow outside with a sickening sound. It was Thomas Weaver, the miner with tuberculosis, now partially thawed by the fire's heat. What science or theology could explain his condition, I cannot say. He was neither alive nor dead in any conventional sense, but in some horrific intermediate state. His flesh, preserved for months in Langford's chamber, had begun to decompose rapidly upon exposure to heat. Yet some primitive function had been restored to his nervous system. His limbs twitched and spasmed as though attempting to remember how to move. From his throat came inhuman sounds, not conscious cries, but the automatic response of vocal cords to air passage. Several women screamed. A miner retched into the snow. Sheriff Blackwood, his face set in grim determination, approached the writhing figure. He removed his coat, covered Weaver's form, and fired a single shot through the fabric. The movement ceased immediately. By now, the preservation chamber was fully engulfed. Through the flame-shattered walls, we could glimpse other figures moving within, the remaining patients in various states of grotesque reanimation as they thawed unevenly in the fire's heat. Their partially frozen bodies, caught between preservation and decay, propelled by some residual neural activity awakened by the warming, created a tableau of horror no witness would ever forget. Dr. Langford watched the scene with an expression of such profound despair that I momentarily pitied him despite everything. "They weren't supposed to wake like this," he murmured, seemingly unaware he was speaking aloud. The revival process required careful temperature control, gradual reintroduction of normal blood flow. This is all wrong. Sheriff Blackwood organized a perimeter around the burning building, keeping the increasingly distraught townspeople at a safe distance. No further rescue attempts were made. The fire was allowed to burn itself out, consuming everything: the doctor's research, his equipment, and the unfortunate souls caught in his well-intentioned but ultimately catastrophic experiment. As night fell and the fire subsided to glowing embers, Dr. Langford remained kneeling in the snow, now covered by a blanket someone had placed around his shoulders. Miss Sullivan, recovered from the smoke but visibly shaken, sat nearby, her face streaked with tears and soot. I approached her cautiously, mindful of her distress yet sympathetic to her evident anguish. "Miss Sullivan," I said softly, "what happened?" She looked up at me with reddened eyes. "I was checking the cooling system," she said, her voice hoarse from smoke. "After our conversation last night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what would happen if the system failed again. I was examining the secondary pumps when I noticed smoke coming from the storage area where we keep the chemicals for the cooling solution. Something must have ignited, perhaps a lantern I set down improperly." Her voice broke. "This is my fault." "Did you intend to start the fire?" I asked. "God, no." Her horror appeared genuine. Whatever my concerns about Dr. Langford's methods, I would never. Those people deserved dignity, whatever their state. I believed her. The fire, it seemed, was a tragic accident rather than deliberate sabotage. Yet I could not help wondering if some cosmic justice had intervened to end an experiment that perhaps should never have begun. Sheriff Blackwood approached us, his usually authoritative manner subdued by the day's events. "Miss Sullivan, you should see to Dr. Langford," he said quietly. "I fear for his state of mind." As she rose to comply, the sheriff turned to me. "Mr. Mercer, I believe your time in Whitethornne has reached its natural conclusion. The morning stage will take you back to Helena. I suggest you be on it." His tone made it clear this was not a suggestion, but an ultimatum. I nodded, understanding that my presence would no longer be tolerated, particularly if I showed any inclination to document the day's horrific events. "And what will happen to Dr. Langford?" I asked. Blackwood's weathered face revealed nothing. "The doctor has suffered a terrible loss. His home and practice are destroyed. I expect he'll return east eventually, to recover among colleagues who might understand his unique perspective on medicine." "And the patients?" I pressed. "Will there be an investigation?" "What patients, Mr. Mercer?" the sheriff replied evenly. "By all official records, those individuals died of their respective conditions months ago. They were buried in our cemetery with proper ceremony. Today's unfortunate fire consumed a doctor's residence and research facility. Nothing more. I understood then that the truth of what had occurred in Whitethornne would never be officially acknowledged. The town would close ranks, protecting both Langford and themselves from the scandal and horror that would inevitably follow any accurate accounting of events. "I see," I said, though what I truly saw was the fragility of truth when confronted with collective denial. As promised, I departed on the morning stage, leaving Whitethornne and its secrets behind. Dr. Langford's fate remains unknown to me. Some months later, I heard rumors of a physician conducting experimental research in cold weather preservation at a private sanitarium in Minnesota, but I could not verify if this was indeed Langford or merely coincidence. Of Miss Sullivan, I know nothing beyond our final conversation. As I boarded the stagecoach, she handed me a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. "Dr. Langford's journal," she said quietly. "His original research notes. He doesn't know I salvaged it from the office before the fire reached that section. Perhaps someday, when enough time has passed, someone should know what was attempted here, both its promise and its terrible cost. I have that journal still, though I have not yet found the courage to read it in its entirety. Some knowledge, perhaps, is better left suspended like Langford's patience, in a state of potential rather than realization." Epilogue. Jonathan Mercer never published his account of the events in Whitethornne. His editors at the Boston Herald received a brief article about silver mining conditions in Montana Territory, with no mention of Dr. Edmund Langford or his preservation chambers. Mercer resigned his position shortly thereafter, citing a desire to pursue more contemplative writing endeavors. He retreated to a small property in rural Massachusetts, where he lived in relative seclusion until his death in 1903. Among his personal effects was found a locked strongbox containing his Montana journal and a second, smaller journal bound in dark leather, presumably Dr. Langford's research notes. His will specified that these documents should remain sealed until 50 years after his death. When the box was finally opened in 1953, it was found to contain only ashes, the journals apparently destroyed by Mercer himself before his death. The town of Whitethornne did not survive long after the events of that winter. The silver veins played out by 1873, and the settlement was largely abandoned. What remains now is merely a footnote in Montana's mining history, with no mention of Dr. Langford or his experiments in any official record. Yet in the nearby communities, particularly among the older residents, stories persist of the frozen doctor and his winter patient's tales, dismissed as frontier folklore by historians but recounted with curious consistency by those whose grandparents lived in that region during the 1870s. Some claim that on the coldest nights, when the wind howls through the abandoned ruins of Whitethornne, the sounds that carry across the snow are not merely the natural creaking of ice and timber, but something more, something caught between states, neither fully present nor entirely gone. As with all such tales from the American frontier, we are left to wonder where documented history ends and legend begins, and whether, in some cases, the legend might contain more truth than the official record would dare acknowledge. The mysterious case of Dr. Langford and his frozen patients remains just that, a mystery preserved in the cold silence of an unforgiving past, neither fully alive in historical record nor completely dead in collective memory.